it is time for me to send the Ibis Ripley AF back to Ibis. It was a demo that was sent to me for a few months, so thank you, Ibis, for letting me borrow the Ripley AF. So in this video, I'm going to kind of just give my wrap up. I've made some other more in-depth reviews that I'll link in the description below. I rode it in the mountains, I rode it on my local trails, I did a comparison with the Transition Spur, so you can check those out if you'd like. A lot of what I'm going to talk about in this video is the alloy frame. How does it compare to carbon? Because I think that's in a lot of people's minds as far as, you know, do I save the $1,000 or whatever it is getting the alloy frame versus the carbon? So in this video, I'll also give some of my highlights of the ride quality of the bike. So let's talk about the three main benefits of carbon. Number one is obviously weight. Usually for a mountain bike, a carbon frame is going to be anywhere between 1 and 3 pounds. Just depends on the bike, lighter than an alloy frame. The other benefit to carbon, equally important as weight in my mind, is the fact that frame builders can build a frame that flexes in one direction but is stiff in another. So for example, let's take a gravel bike. So a gravel bike, you want to flex vertically when you hit a bump to make it ride smoother, but you want it to be stiff laterally. In other words, you don't want the rear wheel to flex back and forth, because that would make for a bike that is hard to ride, it's hard to handle, and also when you put power on the pedals, you don't want the frame to flex too much to put power directly to the rear wheel when you're going. So that's a really important benefit that I'll talk more about when we get into the ride quality of this frame. The third benefit to carbon is the fact that it can absorb kind of trail chatter, little vibrations. So let's use that comparison of carbon to aluminum to talk about how this bike rides. So this particular bike going downhill really amazed me. The bike obviously is heavier than my trail bike, which is a Transition Spur. It's my current trail bike. This bike actually had a really nice planted feel, and I mentioned that in one of my videos. The fact that when you hit bumps, it just felt like it was not as unsettled as a lighter carbon bike. Now, I do like how carbon bikes have that poppy, playful feel, and you can really move it around easily. You can pop it out of a corner. But this bike, you know, it's still playful. It's still really nice geometry. The head angle, I'll put it on the screen, but somewhere around 66.5 degrees. So it's a modern trail bike geometry, which means that it's stable enough to go downhill fast, but it's still lively and playful. More playful than, let's say, an enduro bike. But what I really liked about this alloy frame is how planted and solid it felt on the downhills, especially when you went through like rock gardens. It just felt like it held its line really well. And that was actually a plus to the alloy. Now, the downside to the alloy frame is the fact that it's just heavier. I mean, this is a heavier bike. And I noticed it actually more on my local trails. So I've taken it down to Santos in Ocala, Florida, super fun trail system. I took it out yesterday to San Velasco. And on those trails where you're having to accelerate a lot because there's a lot of twists and turns, that's where the weight of the bike could really be felt. And so on those types of trails, a lighter bike is just a little bit more fun to ride. This bike is still fun, and I think that people who have not ridden a really lightweight carbon bike, you're not really going to notice much of a difference. You may have trouble keeping up with an equally fit person who's on a really light carbon bike, but it's still fun. This is a very fun bike to ride. Now, one thing about this bike that helped it accelerate well out of the corner is the DW Link suspension. And I've used DW Link before. I've owned bikes with DW Link, and it just gives a really firm pedaling platform, especially on the local trails where there's some short, steep uphills. It's not like a long climb where you can kind of just settle into a rhythm and just kind of stay in the saddle. On those short, steep uphills, sometimes you're out of the saddle, but you're putting a lot of torque on the pedals, whether in the saddle or out of the saddle. That's where the DW Link really firmed up and helped the bike not feel as sluggish as it would feel if it had a softer pedaling platform. But yet this bike was plenty plush on the downhill. So it's got 120 mil travel in the rear, 130 in the front. Typical trail bike travel, especially for 29ers. And on the downhills, where I rode up in North Carolina, it just had a really nice feel. I cannot say that I enjoyed downhilling more on my lighter weight trail bike compared to this. And that's the main thing about this bike is, yes, you're going to pay a weight penalty on uphills. You're going to pay the weight penalty on flatter trails. I mean, I honestly felt the weight more on a flatter trail, but on the downhills, which as most of us who mountain bike, that's to me, going downhill on a mountain bike is my favorite thing to do on a bicycle. And so this bike, just as good as any other trail bike that I've ridden. And so, yeah, that's kind of the bottom line is it's a fun bike to go downhill, and you're still going to have fun on other types of trails. Like I said before, it's got the modern trail bike geometry, a little bit lower, a little bit slacker. And so, it feels good on the downhills. Ibis also has some pretty wide rims that come on this bike, and that benefits going downhill. So let's talk about another benefit to this bike, and that is the stiffness. So, you can build really thin walled aluminum frames that are light, but they're going to be flexy, and they're just not going to ride well. This bike, Ibis built this alloy frame beefy. That's one reason it weighs more than a carbon frame, is because, you've got to make aluminum thicker. And Ibis have done a really good job of making this frame stiff. The other thing about carbon that I mentioned, absorbing the trail chatter, could I tell that vibrations came through this frame more? Slightly, but if you've never ridden carbon, or you're just riding this bike a lot, you're really not going to notice it. Yeah, that's my kind of wrap up of the Ibis Ripley AF. It's a great bike. And so again, if you want to watch some of the more detailed reviews I've done on this bike, where I kind of talk about the components, and I'm looking at the bike and just kind of thinking if there's anything else I want to say. I mean, Ibis spec the bike really well. I mean, it's got bigger tires. I've already mentioned this in one of my other reviews, that the tires are bigger on this demo model than if you bought it today, if you can get a bike during this crazy COVID time. But I think that the size of the brake rotors, the gearing, the handlebars, the cockpit, the stem length, it's just dialed. It's a dialed bike. It's a bike that, and here, okay, let me wrap it up this way. If your budget limits you to the alloy frame versus the carbon, get the bike, have a blast on it, and then save up some money one day to put carbon rims on this bike. So ironically, I didn't really plan this, but I love Stan's rims because they have some vertical compliance to them. Get a set of trail bike carbon wheels that are going to be lighter, because rotational weight on a bike is more important than like a lighter frame. Yeah, ideally you have carbon frame and carbon wheels, but getting a bike like this and then putting a set of carbon wheels on one day, when you save up the money, it's a great way to do it, because it gets you out riding, it gets you on the trails, and then and I'm telling you, a lightweight carbon wheel set can dramatically improve the ride quality of a bike. I think I've probably made some videos about that in the past, but that's a huge improvement that you can make. But sticking with these wider alloy rims, you're going to have fun on the bike. That's my wrap up of the Ibis Ripley AF. Again, thanks Ibis for letting me borrow the bike for a few months and getting some really fun rides on it. If you have any questions or comments, drop those below, and let me know also if you've ridden this bike, if you own this bike, if you've compared it to a carbon. Now, I've not compared it to the carbon Ripley, so if any of you out there have done that, let me know what you think about that comparison. That's it. Catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching.